Patch 13.8 was just released, bringing nerfs to all previous S-tier comps in the meta and buffing up some of the weaker units. In this video, I'll take you through every important change in the newest patch, explain how it affects the meta, and give my prediction on the tier list for the foreseeable future. Hacker receives 3 huge changes in this patch. The Omnimap for the Hacker unit themselves is nerfed very heavily, especially at 3 and 4, and the bonus Omnimap for Riders was removed at 3 and lowered at 4. Hacker targeting was also changed, so that the closest enemy is always prioritized, rather than units in the back row. These changes affect LeBlanc carry the most by far, as at 3 Hacker, she loses almost all her healing and gets a nerf to her targeting, which means she can be positioned around and can't solo fights on her own anymore, which should make this comp unplayable, but that's good riddance in my opinion. These nerfs also hit the Gadgetzan Gnar and Hacker Draven comps. Most importantly, Gnar loses a little healing, and it weakens his supporting cast, but he should still be good with +1 Gadgetzan, as Gadgetzan wasn't nerfed. Heart 6 gets a slight buff. This is a good change, as the jump from 4 to 6 wasn't as influential as it should have been, despite having to play weak units like Lulu and Pantheon on your board. This should help comps like Lulu Pantheon Heart Reroll and Power Grid Sona to cap higher, but it won't have a big effect on the meta overall. With Hacker being crushed by multiple nerfs, Infiniteam was bound to rise back up as a top comp, so these are good nerfs to keep it in check. 7 Infiniteam had one of the highest caps in the game, and spiked way too hard when you reached a certain breakpoints, even without good items and upgraded units. The line will still be very playable, just not as impressive as it once was. Oxforce gets a full rework, in addition to losing resistances at 2, 4, and 6. Instead of granting a full second of invulnerability at 1 HP, the units instead gain a 50% shield for 1.5 seconds. This is probably a nerf, as the invulnerability tended to soak up incredible amounts of single target damage from units like Kai'Sa, LeBlanc, Lucian, TF, and Samira, something the shields often cannot do. This changes 2 comps, Oxforce Spellslingers and Riftwalker Renegades with Viego carry. How good the Oxforce Spellslinger comp remains depends on how much of a nerf the rework to the trait is, and how good Riftwalker Viego is depends on how good he's able to use the shield to sustain himself and get another chance to start chaining resets together. Blitzcrank was the best unit in the game for its cost, both as an early game frontline option and as a 3-star in the Lucian reroll comp. The unit was so good that you'd often be itemizing him in later stages with tank items on LeBlanc and Warwick boards. These are pretty decent nerfs, but he should still remain one of the best frontline options in the game, just not as broken as he was before. Gangplank gets some much needed buffs to both his damage and tankiness. He was a terrible early game option, incapable of doing serious damage nor staying alive since he's a melee AP carry. Lucian has been the best stage 2 AP item holder for the entire set so far, but he eventually took over as a 3-star carry capable of one-shotting almost every unit in the game. These nerfs are incredibly impactful, especially at 3-star, as Quickdraw and Renegade both scale off of his raw damage, so this nerf is much larger than it seems. He will likely still be a great early game option and a viable carry, but not something you can force every game like before. Lux gets a buff to her damage. This is nice for Spellslinger and Star Guardian boards on stage 2, but this isn't really a noteworthy change, and her hero augment will continue to be unplayable for other reasons. Nasus has also been quite terrible on stage 2 for the entire set, so the buffs were definitely necessary. These are huge buffs that should make a random 2-star Nasus or Mascot Frontlines more viable in the early game, and might make his carry augment playable as well. Jinx is one of the most inconsistent units in the game, as her cast sometimes ends up doing nothing. The AD and mana buffs are great for her, which should allow her to pump out more consistent damage as an early to mid-game item holder for Anima Squad comps. And Jinx reroll with the carry augment will likely be very good. Gnar's AD was lowered by 5. Gadgetzan Gnar reroll was the most oppressive comp of the last patch, so it's good to see this comp getting nerfed. Due to his scaling with Gadgetzan and AD in a spell and with items, this is a decent sized nerf, but not one that should take him out of the meta. If you get +1 Gadgetzan early, you should still be excited to play this comp. During the last patch, Kai'Sa reroll quickly became one of the top comps in the meta. The comp's ability to stabilize hard on stage 3 and 4 and cap out very high, even with Kai'Sa 2, allowed for a lot of flexibility, even if you weren't contested. Kai'Sa was often able to just blow through frontlines and even beat hacker boards when positioned correctly, so these nerfs were definitely warranted. She will still be playable as an AP carry, just not as dominant as before. Rammus gets a small buff, his stun now being increased from 1.25 to 1.5 seconds, which should make him more appealing in the early and mid game. Shen gets a couple of changes that leave him nerfed at 2-star and power neutral at 1-star. He often tanked way too much when tethering to your carries, so it's nice to see this change. Bel'Veth was one of the weaker AD carries on the previous patch, as you'd usually prefer to play Sure Shot backlines instead of Bel'Veth. Her main problem is her inconsistency and propensity to just get targeted down due to her low range, so while this buff may help her be more viable on mech and brawler boards, she probably won't be a premier carry in the meta like she was in the last set. Lucian's support augment was incredibly powerful for both Kai'Sa and Lucian reroll boards, so this nerf definitely makes sense, though it might be too overboard, combined with the nerfs to Lucian and Kai'Sa themselves as well. Pantheon's carry augment was overperforming for both Heart reroll and Lucian reroll boards, so this was also a good nerf, though this augment mostly relies on the fact that Pantheon is one of the best units in the game. Pantheon's support augment has been perhaps the best hero augment in the game for 2 patches now, and it's finally getting a nerf. This augment allowed Heart reroll boards to stack AP safely without getting blown up, and Infiniteam boards to easily tank long enough for Ultimate Ezreal to cast, all while having great power in the early game. This augment is still very good after that change, but not as oppressive as it was before. Renekton's carry augment gets a pretty big buff, but its strength really depends on its matchup spread against top comps, something it has struggled with throughout this set so far. Wukong's carry augment now grants him a little more AP. This really doesn't do too much for this augment, which has been terrible forever, so don't expect anything to change. Ezreal's carry augment was bugged to not stack AP and attack speed, while the parallel trait was in, so it's good to see this fixed. However, parallel is still not often worth playing, as it actually makes Ezreal fire less projectiles, and therefore he doesn't actually activate Quick Draw as often. Lee Sin's carry augment gets a buff after a huge nerf that left it nearly unplayable after its dominance from months before. The augment will definitely be takeable in the right situations once again, but it likely won't be as broken as it once was. LeBlanc's support augment gets a buff, but it'll still be underwhelming, as the augment generally doesn't do too much for your board in the early and mid game, unless you high roll a 2-star 4-cost tank or a 5-cost threat. Rammus is much harder to fit on boards in set 8.5 than in set 8, so a buff to his support augment should make this augment more pickable. If Pantheon's support augment wasn't the best hero augment in the game, then Shen's support augment definitely was. This augment has been broken since the launch, and it's playable in so many different comps. This nerf has been a long time coming, though the augment will still be very good. Vayne's carry augment gets a nerf again. This augment has been repeatedly nerfed over the past couple of months, and has continued to remain good, though this one should finally put it more in line. The main problem with this augment is that Anima Squad and Duelists are pretty bad in the meta right now, so it's likely not worth playing into this, but if these comps rise in future patches, then this augment will likely be very good again. Vex's carry augment gets a nice buff, but this will not really have an impact on its viability. Vex is not a good enough carry at the moment, and this augment lives and dies by Vex's current strength. Echo's carry augment keeps getting buffs, but it's generally really hard to play this augment as you're usually building tank items for Echo and carry items on other units. Leona's carry augment gets a small mana and AP buff, which might make Mech Leona much stronger as an option if you hit this. Her support augment has been one of the best augments in the game for a while now, but this one might be pickable now. Urgot's support augment has been pretty weak this set, and it gets another buff. This is a nice buff, and should make this augment takeable as a safe option if you miss, but you're never excited to pick this. Scoped Weapons was the only normal augment buffed on this patch, getting 2 attack speed. I'm not really sure what the point of buffing this was, as the augment was already good for Warwick, Jax, and Bel'Veth, and it's small enough that it won't have an effect on anything, as the augment is mostly for range and not attack speed. Finally, something very important they changed is that all hero augments had their text changed, such that only your strongest unit will get the buff. This is very impactful for hero augments like Aesol carry, Poppy carry, Camille carry, Bel'Veth carry, and many others, so keep an eye out for that. Now let's get onto my predictions for the early meta of patch 13.8. For context, here is the tier list of the previous meta in patch 13.7b. And here is a very rough early prediction of the meta for the new patch. Of the hacker comps, LeBlanc should fall completely out of the meta after the nerfs, while Gnar should remain very good, but he's more reliant on +1 Gadgettine now. Lucian and Kai'Sa drop down after nerfs to their spells as well. Laser Core Warwick becomes a top comp, especially with +1 Laser Core, due to the better front-to-back comps getting nerfed, while Mech Garen rises to S tier as the premier frontline to play flexibly around. You can play carries like MF, Aesol, Bel'Veth, and Samira around him, they are all good. Infiniteam and Spellslingers remain good comps to default to into the meta from AD and AP openers. This patch is very fresh, and a new meta will definitely appear, so the tier list might be totally different in a few days, Therefore, be on the lookout for my final tier list video this weekend so that you can keep up with the meta on this new patch. Thank you so much for watching. If you learned something, please leave a like and subscribe to the channel. If you want cheat sheets for any of my comp guides, they're available for YouTube members and patrons, and the links to those are down in the description. And if you want to get better at TFT, join the Discord. We got over 9,000 other players there who are hungry to climb. And if you want to get coached by me, the information is over on the Discord server as well. So take care and see you in the next video.